Bulletproof Radio, a state of high performance.
You're listening to Bulletproof Radio with Dave Asprey. Today's cool fact of the day is about the numbers in your brain. Specifically, it weighs about 3.3 pounds. It's about 60% fat, which means it's one of your fattiest organs. But especially if you're a woman, probably not the fattiest organ. But you probably didn't know there are 100,000 miles of blood vessels in your brain, about 4 times around the equator of the Earth, which is kind of cool. And you've got billions of nerve fibers called axons and dendrites, which you've heard me talk about before. But did you know there's about 100 billion neurons in your brain, but they're only about 10% of the brain. And they have that power because they reach out to 100 trillion plus trigger points, which is what you could call a neuron forest. And your brain can make about 23 watts of power when you're awake, which is not quite enough to charge your iPhone, but you maybe could if you weren't thinking. And your brain processes information at somewhere around 1 mile per hour up to 268 miles an hour. And what that means is they're actually measuring how fast electrons flow in the brain, which is kind of cool. So you can think both fast and slow, as the title of a famous book would tell you. All right, that was some cool stuff about the brain. And if that wasn't a case of foreshadowing, where I tell you what we're going to talk about on today's show, then I've never foreshadowed. But before we get into today's awesome topic, today's guest is Dr. David Feifel. He's a master clinician, a certified neuropsychiatrist, and very accomplished brain scientist who founded the Kadima Neuropsychiatry Institute in San Diego in 2017. After having been a full professor of psychiatry at UC San Diego for more than 20 years. And there's a couple things we're going to talk about today. One is that 10 years ago, he developed the world's first ketamine infusion program for psychiatric disorders and integrated it into the UCSD Center for Advanced Treatments. So we're talking about one of the first guys using ketamine in psychiatry this way, which is really, really fascinating. And because that wasn't enough for him, he's also one of the top guys looking at transcranial magnetic stimulation and ketamine and the brain. So you wanted more brain hackers, you got more brain hackers. Dr. Feifel, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. It's a real pleasure to be here.
How do you feel when I call you a brain hacker? Good thing, bad thing?
I think it's a good thing. I love everything about the brain. It was a great intro. All those facts about the brain, because I just think I'm obsessed with it. It's cool. So, I'll take almost any description that involves the brain. I'm okay with it.
You definitely love the brain because you've written more than 100 research papers and book chapters and whatnot on different brain functions and have really been at the forefront of your field for a long time. And I always like to know, what drives people to do what they do? Why did you become a preeminent brain scientist? Why that?
You may regret that question. When I was younger, my first intellectual awakening, you're a goofy high school student, and then one day you start to think seriously about things. But my first intellectual awakening was reading about quantum physics and realizing that, scientists, like really serious scientists, we're saying that the reality around us is, these guys were hardcore physicists. Reality around us is not what it appears to be. And if I'm sure you're aware, the standard, what they call the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics is that consciousness actually is responsible for creating the material world around us. Now, that's a crazy thing for a bunch of serious scientists like Niels Bohr to say. And I thought that was so cool. And I was basically I became really interested in consciousness. And once you start thinking about consciousness, it leads you to the brain, and one thing leads to another. And, a few decades later, I suddenly find myself doing in medical school, doing an MD, PhD program, and wanting to be, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist. So that's the short version.
Did you actually clinically practice psychiatry?
I did, yes, and do.
You still actually see patients?
Yes. I'm in my office right now. There are patients. My colleague is treating right now with ketamine. Just to give you the sense of what's going on.
Well, so but you've done a ton of research. I find oftentimes when people are writing hundreds of papers, they're oftentimes in an academic setting, they don't see a lot of patients. But you've been
Correct.
You've been hands-on with patients your entire career. Then
yes, when I came to UCSD, because I was primarily interested in research, and I didn't think that the clinical practice of psychiatry was all that interesting, but I thought the research aspect was great. Along the way, I fell in love with the clinical work, and all my mentors said, as soon as you get enough grants, buy yourself out of the clinical work so you can focus on the research, and it's a very common thing in academic institutions that you have very renowned, psychiatrists, or really it's true for any specialty, but they don't see patients because they're spending most of their time, writing papers and going to conferences. And I kind of I didn't take that advice. I said, gosh, I still love research, but now I have this newfound love for clinical work. And so what I'm going to do is exactly what everyone tells me is the worst thing I should do, and that is I'm going to actually really try and do both well and spend a lot of time doing both. And I've done that. It's not been always the easiest thing, but I'm really glad that I have.
How do you define the line between psychiatry and psychology for people who are listening? Because it seems like there's always some overlap there. You're dealing with a past trauma, and a psychologist would put you on a couch, but in psychiatry, you might do something different. But how do you, in your own mind, and how do you tell people the difference?
It's really arbitrary. I would even include in some ways neurology. Yeah. These are sort of arbitrary divisions that have come up over the years due to political issues, or just sort of or sometimes they're just historical. And I think that if you think of Sigmund Freud, I mean, he's in many ways the father of psychological interventions, but he was also a trained neurologist, and he believed that ultimately, all these disorders that he was trying to address were seated in the structure of the brain, but that at the time, around the turn of the century, they just didn't have the tools to directly intervene. So he believed that the therapies that he was developing were sort of an indirect way of doing biological modifications of the brain. He wrote something in I think it was in 1893 about the sort of the scientific basis of psychotherapy, and it was very it was very much neuroscience. So I think that we're all dealing with mental states, and some because of economic forces and insurance and so forth. Psychologists and because of their licensing limitations, focus on trying to change the brain by exchanging meaningful sounds with patients, and those sounds are words, and psychiatrists have tended in the last 4 decades or so have sort of moved away from that and tended to focus on trying to change the brain by exchanging, magnetic pulses or chemicals, transfer them into patients' bodies. But I think at the end of the day, it's the distinction is a gradient.
I'm so happy that you said that. I've always had a hard time really telling the difference. That when I set out saying something's wrong in my head, and I feel like I'm failing out of Wharton, which I didn't fail out of Wharton, but I think I came kind of close. Something's not right, and I ended up seeing a psychiatrist first, fortunately, because I wanted quantitative data about what's going on in my head. not necessarily to go see a psychologist and talk about what's going on in my head, but I think there's great value in that, and I've had great value from it. So I wouldn't know if a friend called and say, who should you call, a neurologist? And what you're saying is that it's all on the spectrum, so it depends where you want to start. Okay, that's helpful. And the direct interventions on the brain, neurofeedback, neuromodulation, transcranial, magnetic stuff is very cutting edge. And in that sphere of brain hacking, I would put electrical stimulation and magnetic stimulation as some of the most cutting edge things out there. But you can buy home equipment to do electrical stim on your brain, which I started doing 20 years ago, full disclosure. And magnetic stimulation you can buy for $500 and up online. Does that scare the crap out of you?
Yes and no. It is a little scary that lay people now have the ability to directly alter their brain. I think that the brain has generally a homeostatic mechanism that a lot of these things that that are accessible to people at home probably are limited in how much severe harm they could do. So we haven't yet released anything into the public market that's when people are doing self ECT. Then I'll really get worried. But so I think that a lot of the things so far are fairly benign. Although of course people will always say, hey, we don't know the long-term effects of these things like transcranial stimulation and so forth. But they seem to be low voltage and on the other hand, I'm not so sure just how effective they are in terms of their selectivity. So I think that some of the things that I'm really interested in the field, in the directions the field, I hope the field goes, I think are going to be much more sophisticated and not the kind of thing that will ever be available to the public.
I have over years, I've had my own EEG for 20 years, usually more than one. And after a certain point, I realized that it's probably not that wise to do brain surgery on yourself. And so I ended up starting a little company that does EEG neurofeedback in Seattle, just because I needed access to someone who's going to tell me what to do, because I can hook the electrodes up. But if you're part of the loop there are some forms that are generally supportive and good, and you can do those without expertise. But I also wouldn't work on my own race car if I was going to be driving it, because I probably want a professional mechanic. And that's where I look at the role of neurologists and psychiatrists to help us improve ourselves. But I've been really frustrated, Dr. Feifel. Usually if you go to a psychiatrist, there's something wrong with your brain, and let's see if we can fix it. And I'm not that interested. I don't think there's much wrong with my brain today. I just want a brain that's twice as fast and twice as smart and will live 10 times longer than Mother Nature wants it to be. And it seems like whenever I ask for that, I get the response, well, more tests are needed. I'm like, well, let me be the test already. Come on here. So where is your field on helping us get Professor X brains versus just heal depression, which is worth doing, obviously?
That field is generally falls under the term neuroenhancement, which is very interesting, because starting about 10 years ago, there began sort of a public, let's say, an open discussion among brain specialists about whether this is ethical and something that neurologists, psychiatrists should do. There's a controversy, but a lot of people, and including there was a ethical committee from one of the neurological societies that looked at this and came to the following conclusion. They said, look, it may not be the best use of physicians, because traditionally the physician kind of heals and takes pathology and tries to remediate it. But just like cosmetic surgery, it's not unethical. And if a neurologist or psychiatrist could add a quality of life to somebody, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. That wasn't accepted by everybody. It did provoke a lot of disagreement, but so it is a controversial thing. But the brain is interesting because it's different than every other organ, because if you have a kidney, right, and your kidney is performing what it needs to do, I mean, it's clearing the toxins from your blood, that's all that's all you really, that's fine. I mean, there's no point in making it to clear twice as much blood volume than you actually have in the same amount of time, because it really isn't going to impact your ability to function. But the brain, I mean, when is a brain good enough? You know what I mean? It's the brain is how, is a heart and soul of who we are and how we